An awful lot gets blamed on the influence of feminism. Everyone from neo-Nazis on the Daily Storm to centre-left egalitarians like Sargon love to jump on the bandwagon. Feminism, the great Marxist evil of our age. If only we could find some way of defeating it. Honestly, I can't help but be reminded of the devout Christian who, after failing or perhaps willfully refusing to understand the concept of evolution, simply proclaims that God done it. I think to a lot of people, MRAs, libertarians, tradcons, Gamergate, neo-masculinists, and of course MGTOW as well, feminism represents a very convenient answer to a very complicated set of problems. Most of the comments critical of my last video about the gender attraction differential centered around my closing statement and the fact that I hadn't conclusively shown that the disparity was biological, that the gender differences we observe on these dating sites are modern and most easily explained by a century of cultural conditioning where women were taught to be entitled narcissists and men were taught that they are violent animals in constant need of checking their privilege. And yet, modern feminism, the catch-all answer, can't even begin to explain the ratio of female to male ancestry observed in our DNA, or the fact that chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, seem to show the very same sex selection ratios in their reproductive habits. For the sake of brevity and staying on topic, I quickly glossed over those facts at the end of my last video, but I think a more in-depth look at them may serve as a good starting point for this video. The screenshot that I quickly flashed up at the end of that video was this study on NCBI PubMed titled Male Dominance Rank and Reproductive Success in Chimpanzees, and it contains this table which lists the 23 observed male chimps featured in the study, ranked by the number of offspring they sired. Now, if we take that number of offspring to be a rough indication of that particular individual's attractiveness to the reproductively fit female chimps in the group, we can actually make a direct comparison between perceived attractiveness in male humans and in male chimpanzees. So let's plot this data against the graph I created in my last video that was based on OkCupid and Tinder statistics. Almost half the male chimpanzees didn't reproduce at all. Most of those who did only had a few offspring until we get to the alphas, with the number one chimp siring an impressive 7 offspring. Now, we're talking raw numbers of offspring, so what I'm going to do is normalize this graph by scaling the whole thing up, assuming that the top chimp who sired 7 offspring is basically seen by his female counterparts as a 10 on the chimpanzee hotness scale. He's basically our chimpanzee Ryan Gosling. I know I shouldn't be as surprised as I am by this, but it really is just fucking amazing, isn't it? That an approximated S-curve showing perceived attractiveness in human males based on modern online dating statistics from OkCupid and Tinder could so perfectly match the real-world unrestrained reproductive habits of our closest living primate relatives. It's so similar you'd almost think we were looking at the exact same data rather than two different, albeit related species. Just astounding. Now, on its face, the hereditary findings in human DNA don't seem like they tell us as much. Numbers like 2 to 1 often get thrown around, which is interesting in itself, but not terribly descriptive. However, if we look at one of the main studies that actually examines this data, which Stardust covered in his recent Neolithic hypergamy video, we see a much more interesting picture start to form. It's a fairly well-known fact that by tracking the propagation of certain hereditary mutations, we can actually map when certain human populations become geographically and therefore genetically isolated from each other. However, we can take this a step further. By comparing Y chromosomal drift against the hereditary mutations in mitochondrial DNA across those genetically diverse populations, as well as comparisons against our somewhat limited collection of ancient DNA samples, we can actually separate the population by gender and map the effective population size over time. Effective population size being the number of individuals who genetically contribute to the next generation, as seen in this graph from the study. Far more interesting than a simple 2-to-1 ratio, as the environment changes, such as it did during the Neolithic Revolution, we see the effective population ratio skew to a massive 17-to-1. For every 17 females having offspring, they are doing it with only one male. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, it's also worth noting the vertical scale on these graphs. I'm not exactly sure where this often cited 2-to-1 ratio actually comes from, because the graph scale measuring effective population size here is almost 3.5 times larger for women, across the entire time scale. Even at the graph's peak, for every 150 males siring offspring, more than 500 females are reproducing. I can't help but think the number should be more like 3-to-1 or even 4-to-1. Now, this is all very archaeological and impersonal. And if we want a clear first-hand look at these gendered reproductive trends unmarred by industrialisation or large-scale economies, there are in fact modern hunter-gatherers that we can actually observe today. Information on the rates and structure of hunter-gatherer intimate relationships are actually quite difficult to find, probably due to a range of factors from anthropology and sociology relying on politically correct ideals of the noble savage, to just the practical difficulties of observing remote primitive cultures without necessarily influencing them. In my own country, despite cultural changes over the last century, I know for a fact that traditional Aboriginal culture is polygynous. I've seen it firsthand, and it's even been the subject of feature-length films like 10 Canoes, which actually tells the story of a young hunter-gatherer who covets one of his older brother's 3 wives. I'd highly suggest anyone interested in these subjects check it out. It's a dramatisation rather than a documentary, but it gives a fantastic insight into the everyday lives of pre-colonial nomadic hunter-gatherers. However, most of the information I could find seems to be in the form of discussions by government and private welfare organisations about how this aspect of culture should be dealt with in the wider context of Australia, which legally defines marriage as one man to one woman. They note that polygyny is a component of traditional Aboriginal life, but they don't give anything in the way of actual rates, statistics, or even an explanation of tribal structure beyond the most basic description of kinship and skin names. Any actual studies on this aspect of Aboriginal life, if they exist, were basically impossible for me to find. I was, however, able to find this study on the Royal Society Open Science Journal titled Polygyny Without Wealth, Popularity in Gift Games Predicts Polygyny in Biyaka Pygmies, which contains some very relevant statistics and also mentions in the abstract some of the problems I've had finding this data. Quote, "The occurrence of polygynous marriage in hunter-gatherer societies which do not accumulate wealth remains largely unexplored since resource availability is dependent on male hunting capacity and limited by lack of storage. Hunter-gatherer societies offer the greatest insight to human evolution since they represent the majority of our species' evolutionary history." End quote. So the study's methodology basically involves the observation of an anonymous gift-giving game performed amongst several tribes. I guess you could think of this as the Stone Age hunter-gatherer version of Tinder. Unsurprisingly, the number of likes, in this case represented by honey sticks, don't fall on a linear distribution. Quote, "In 2 of the 3 camps where the gift game was played, the individual with the highest number of gifts was polygynous. Both of these men were the Kembetis, an appointed spokesperson of a camp of their respective camps. In Longa, this individual received 9 honey sticks compared to the camp male average of 2.6. Similarly, in Ibamba, these figures were 17 and 4.5 respectively." End quote. Okay, so like the chimpanzees earlier, I just want to normalise these raw honey stick numbers against my 0 through 10 scale of attractiveness, assuming that the top tribesmen of the Biyaka were considered the male 10s of their culture. Now, we can see there is some variation. it would appear that in the primitive communistic hunter-gatherer tribes, hypergamy is less pronounced, probably due to the only measurement of these tribal males being their subjective social capital. In modern times, with objective differences in accumulated financial capital, it seems much more pronounced. In times of transition between the two, such as the Neolithic period, where socially rich hunters are directly competing against resource-rich farmers, the reproductive ratio goes off the chart, so to speak. And of course, we always have to take reproductive comparisons between humans and other primates with a grain of salt. However, despite the variations, one thing remains absolutely consistent in every single one of these metrics, cross-culturally, cross-time period, and even cross-species with our primate cousins. The average male is naturally seen as below average by his female counterparts. Do we live in a cultural climate of man-hating, where men are seen as inherently less valuable than women? Well, yeah, I guess we do. But you have to understand that this so-called culture, how we all get along with each other and conduct ourselves as a large group, is really nothing more than a collective manifestation of our innate biological instincts. That is, we are innately wired at the individual level to see most men as less reproductively valuable than women, and as a result, that biological bias is simply compounded at the aggregate level as gynocentric culture. People seem to have this rosy idea that with enough activism and politicking and hard work, culture can be changed. But this culture rests on a firm foundation of biology. Trying to change the superficial online dating trends that we observe in modern society and, the less superficial social problems that flow on from that means first changing some very fundamental axioms of biological reproduction, which frankly goes beyond humans and even beyond the other great apes. I hate to say it, but if any MRAs are listening, this kind of cultural change is well beyond our means to control and will probably always remain so. This kind of consistency isn't just some arbitrary conditioning that we can be learned out of, and it certainly can't be explained away with a relatively recent Western political ideology. This is deeply biological and goes back to the days before we ever ventured out of Africa. With that statement, I could end the video right here, but I actually want to explore this gap between the biological and the ideological a little deeper.